I never thought a book could change my life. I am a 67-year-old woman, with a calm and predictable routine, surrounded by friends who love to talk about the same topics as always. But all that changed when I discovered the novels of Arthur, an author of erotic stories that left me intrigued. Your words danced in my mind. And every page I turned took me to a world I had never imagined. I was captivated by its passionate characters, their fiery adventures and the freedom they lived. The passion that overflowed in their stories lit a fire inside me, a desire to explore what I had forgotten over the years. But before we dive into that story, tell us which state you're watching this video from. And if you like this touching story, don't forget to subscribe. As I lost myself in the pages, I realized I was beginning to idealize the characters' lives. They were bold, fearless and, above all, free. Why couldn't I be like that too? An uncontrollable desire took hold of me, and soon I began to dress like the Arthur characters, talk like them, and behave in ways that my friends would never imagine. My world turned into a stage, where every day was a new scene. And I was the protagonist of a play that seemed more exciting than real life. However, this new life brought with it an unsettling tension. My friends started to notice the changes in me, and soon the questions came. What happened to you, and why do you look so different? They didn't understand that, behind the fantasy, there was a woman in search of something more, a meaning that was slipping out of my hands. And so, my dilemma began. How far would I go to live this new identity? My transformation was not instantaneous. What started as simple reading became an addiction. Arthur was not just an author, he became a constant presence in my life. His books were everywhere, on the nightstand, in the bag I carried, and even in the kitchen, where I tried to recreate some of the recipes that appeared in their stories. Every time I sat down to read, it was as if he was whispering secrets in my ear, encouraging me to break free from the shackles of monotony. The first step I took towards this new life was a simple red dress, with a cut I would never have considered wearing before. When I saw myself in the mirror, the woman I looked back at was different. I was no longer the discreet and reserved lady that everyone knew. I was a seductress, a lover of life, ready to explore every moment with fervor. The heat of passion that I had read about in books now manifested within me. The nervousness and adrenaline were delicious, and I felt more alive than ever. My friends, however, began to worry. One afternoon, over tea at Lucia's house, I couldn't help but share some of Arthur's stories. The look of shock that crossed Lucia's face made me hesitate. You can't be serious, Claudia. Do you really identify with these characters? What I saw as empowerment, they saw as madness. The nervous laughter that followed left me in doubt. Was it a simple tale or a vision of the freedom I longed for? That afternoon, the laughter that should have been joyful became silent tension, with each of us knowing that the line between normality and madness was narrowing. The pressure started to build, and my need to live like the characters in the books became more intense. One night, while walking through the park, I saw a little bookstore that always went unnoticed. Something inside me asked me to enter. As I walked through the door, I was greeted by a welcoming scent of paper and ink. The shelves were filled with novels, and an entire section was dedicated to Arthur's works. My hands shook as I selected one of her books, a new story that promised more passion and adventure. As I flipped through the pages, a bold idea took shape in my mind. Why not incorporate some of the eroticism I read in his books into my real life? I started to imagine what it would be like to flirt with strangers, like the characters in Arthur. It was an electrifying sensation, a mixture of fear and excitement. The thought of venturing beyond what I considered safe appealed to me more and more. I was no longer just a spectator in my life. I wanted to be the protagonist, living each moment as if it were the last scene of a great show. That same night, with my heart racing, I decided to do something impulsive. I put on the red dress I had bought and went to a local bar. Vibrant music and flashing lights surrounded me. When I walked in, I realized that the energy of the place was contagious. Eyes turned to me, and a young man, who looked half my age, approached. With a confident smile, he greeted me and, without thinking twice, I flirted back, feeling more alive than ever. The line between fantasy and reality was disappearing, and I didn't want this moment to end. That night, I let myself be carried away by the current of life. The conversation with the young man flowed so naturally that it felt like I had known him for years. We laughed and shared stories, and I felt as if every word we exchanged was a new page in a narrative that only the two of us were writing. The atmosphere was one of complicity, and adrenaline pulsed through my veins. Every look we exchanged seemed to carry promises of a world I had only dreamed of before. But as the night unfolded, a voice whispered in my mind, "This is senseless, Claudia." I remembered the worried looks from my friends and Lucia's words. What was I doing? I had lost sight of the difference between what was real and what was a fantasy created by Arthur. Yet this sense of freedom was so intoxicating that I felt ready to ignore any doubts that might arise. The desire to live intensely surpassed my conscience. And every moment with that young man felt like an act of rebellion against a life that no longer satisfied me. As the hours progressed, the conversation deepened, and he began asking questions about my life. I found myself telling stories about a Claudia that no longer existed, the woman I let myself be for so long. It was as if I was playing a role, and the young man was the spectator of this new version of me. The words that came out of my mouth were laced with sass and humor, and I realized I was having fun like never before. But still, a part of me hesitated. I knew I couldn't sustain this illusion forever. What started as simple flirting was turning into something more, something I wasn't sure I could control. And, as I toasted another glass of wine, reality began to slip away, and the thread between fantasy and real life became increasingly tenuous. I was in an abyss, about to take the next step towards an unknown destination. That encounter left an indelible mark on me. Over the next few days, I found myself reliving every moment of that night in my thoughts. The young man had become a constant echo in my mind, and the adventures that Arthur described in his books became a reference in my life. It was as if I had access to a new chapter, a new story that could live. However, the dilemma that arose could not be ignored. I was sinking into a web of lies and illusions, and the line between what was real and what was fantasy was becoming increasingly blurred. The pressure was growing. Lucia and the other friends continued to question me about my changes. Their concern began to turn into distrust, and the weight of expectations piled on my shoulders. "Claudia, are you okay? You don't look the same," said a friend. These comments began to worry me. I didn't want them to see my bold side as a sign of weakness or a symptom of some midlife crisis. It was just a phase of rediscovery, I thought. But the truth was that I was losing control. That afternoon, I went to the bookstore where it all started. I was drawn to Arthur's section, and as I looked between the covers, I saw a new edition of one of his novels. The story revolved around an older woman who falls in love with a younger man, exploring the freedom of living without limits. My heart raced when I read the synopsis. It was as if Arthur was writing about me. This idea made me nervous, but also excited. The freedom that the character felt seemed accessible. But I knew that living this fantasy would require difficult choices. I decided I needed to find a balance between my new life and the reality I didn't want to completely abandon. But as another glass of wine crossed my path, the feeling of being on the edge of a precipice began to haunt me. What I was doing was risky, and at the same time, deeply attractive. I was about to make decisions that could change my life forever. With each passing day, the tension increased. The choices I made were not just about the life I wanted, but also about the impact they would have on the people around me. I couldn't ignore that my friends were worried, and that worry began to manifest itself in more direct conversations. Lucia finally confronted me. "Claudia, you need to be honest with yourself. This new behavior is not you." Her words hit me like an arrow, but instead of hurting me, they awakened something inside me. I needed to face what I was doing. It was in this moment of vulnerability that I decided it was time to find Arthur. Not just as a fan, but as a woman who longs to understand the essence of their stories. I sent him a message, asking for a meeting. Anxiety consumed me as I waited for the answer. How could I explain to him what his words had done for me? How could I confess that their stories had transformed me into something I barely recognized myself? When I received the answer, my heart sank. He agreed to meet me at a charming cafe, a place I had always dreamed of visiting. But I never had the courage to enter. Upon arrival, I was enveloped by a comforting aroma of coffee and fresh pastries. The nervousness was palpable, and upon seeing him, I realized he was more attractive than I'd imagined. The words I planned to say caught in my throat as his presence paralyzed me. The conversation flowed quickly. I introduced myself as a great admirer, but as we spoke, I realized that I wanted more than just to praise his works. I wanted him to see the woman that was forming in me, the woman who wanted to break free from the chains of society. Arthur listened intently, his eyes shining with interest. But when he asked about my life, the truth began to consume me. I was about to open up about the double life I was leading, and the fear of being judged threatened to swallow my courage. Would he be able to understand my internal struggle? The tension rose as I considered the revelation I was about to make. Arthur watched, his gaze attentive and curious. The cafe was full of life, but all I could hear was the pounding sound of my heart. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Arthur," I began. "Your stories changed my life in ways I never expected. I started to live like your characters." The confession escaped my lips like a whisper, but his reaction was immediate. His eyes widened, and he remained silent for a moment, processing my words. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and encouraging. "It's fascinating to know that my stories have this effect on you. What you are experiencing is a reflection of what you feel, and that is important." This validation gave me a boost of confidence, but insecurity still hung in the air. I wanted him to see not just the woman I was becoming, but also the struggle I faced balancing my two lives. The conversation deepened, and I shared more about the new freedom I was experiencing. I described the night at the bar, the young man I met, and how everything seemed like a dream. Arthur listened attentively, but also began to question me. "Aren't you afraid of losing who you really are by getting lost in this fantasy world?" This question hit me hard. I didn't want to be just a character in a story, but the desire to escape reality was so strong. From her questions, I realized there was a side of me that still wanted to be accepted. Who sought validation from society? What I was doing was a search for freedom, but at the same time, I was trapped in the expectation of pleasing others. Arthur continued, "Living an authentic life requires courage. And this courage comes from within, not from fantasies." Your perspective was starting to enlighten me, and a new understanding was welling up within me. For an instant, the line between reality and fantasy blurred, and I saw a path. What I really wanted was not just to live in a fantasy, but to find a way to integrate these new aspects of myself into my everyday life. How would it be possible? That was a dilemma I still needed to resolve. In the days following my meeting with Arthur, a new perspective began to form in my mind. His words resonated like a constant echo, instigating deep reflection about who I really was and who I wanted to be. The fantasy that had enveloped me until then seemed like a veil that was beginning to fade, revealing a more authentic Claudia, but also more vulnerable. I began to question what it meant to live a true life, especially after having explored so many made-up worlds. The relationship with the young man also came to haunt me. Our conversations became more frequent, and he took me to places I had never imagined going. But there was something that worried me. Was I just using this new connection as a way to escape realities I didn't want to face? Lucia had mentioned that I was moving away from everyone, but every time I saw the young man, a mixture of emotion and anxiety arose. It was a fine line between the excitement of something new and the awareness of what was at stake. One afternoon, when meeting my friends, I felt the need to share what I was experiencing. "I met someone," he said, hesitating. The table stopped and everyone looked at me, surprised. Lucia, with a worried look, asked, "Are you sure about this? How do you feel about it?" The questions that followed made me anxious, but I also felt it was time to be honest. I talked about the young man, how he had brought a new life to me, and how my friendship with Arthur encouraged me to be more daring. But reactions were mixed. While some were excited, others were cautious. "Claudia, you must protect yourself. It can be dangerous to get involved with someone much younger." Those words hit me deeply. I knew there were risks, but the feeling of living intensely was so powerful that I was willing to take that risk. At the same time, I realized that this new life was putting all my relationships to the test. Each friend seemed to carry the expectation that I would be the Claudia they knew, and I was transforming into someone completely different. That night, I returned home reflecting on the consequences of my choices. Would I really be ready to give up everything I knew for a new experience, even a passionate one? The fear of losing security made me hesitate, but the idea of living without limits and without regrets was too tempting. Doubt grew, but so did a sense of empowerment. Now, the question was how to deal with the truth about who I really was. The pressure was building. Each day became a delicate dance between my friends' expectations and the new life I was building. I felt like a juggler, trying to balance past and present balls, and the risk of a fall seemed imminent. The double life began to take its toll. And the insecurity turned into a weight that I could no longer ignore. At the same time, the young man who had entered my life continued to seduce me with promises of adventures and moments of passion. One night, after a particularly difficult day, I decided to meet him. The place chosen was a cozy bar, where soft music created a perfect atmosphere to forget your worries. He was there, waiting, with a smile that lit up my heart. Conversations flowed like a serene river, and for a moment, everything seemed perfect. But as the night progressed, the reality of my choices began to set in. The young man took me dancing, and as we spun around the dance floor, I was enveloped by the emotion of the moment. But in the middle of the dance, the image of my friends' worried faces appeared in my mind. What was I doing? I was moving away from them, losing myself in something that could be ephemeral. The young man's laughter sounded like music. But there was a voice inside me that kept whispering, "What if you lose it all?" This uncertainty began to eat away at me, and at the same time, a spark of rebellion burned within me. When we finally returned to the table, he held my hand, and the connection between us felt unbreakable. "You seem distant, Claudia. What's going on?" he asked, his eyes fixed on mine. The intensity of his gaze made me hesitate. "I'm just thinking about all of this, my life and the people around me." I didn't want to be the person who would hurt others because of a fleeting desire, but at the same time, I didn't want to abandon the woman that was emerging inside me. Arthur's words echoed in my mind. Living an authentic life meant facing what was happening and deciding what I really wanted. As I looked into the young man's eyes, I realized this decision wasn't just about him or what my friends thought. It was about me and the future I wanted. I needed to choose between the security of the past and the uncertainty of the future, between the life I knew and the freedom I so longed for. The next morning, I woke up with a clouded mind, full of unanswered questions. What did I really want? The life I had built with my friends, which had always been safe and predictable, or the excitement and uncertainty that the young man offered me? The dilemma weighed on my heart. As I looked out the window, the sunlight illuminated my little garden. And I realized it was time to make a decision. What did I want more, the security of familiarity or the courage to reinvent myself? With that thought, I picked up the phone and called Lucia. I wanted to see her and clarify what was happening. We met at a cafe we used to frequent. Anxiety accompanied me at every step. But I knew I needed to be honest. When Lucia arrived, her expression was one of concern. "Claudia, what is happening? You look different," she said, as we sat down. The light in the cafe was soft, and for a moment, I felt relieved to be next to her. I took a deep breath and shared everything, my passion for the young man, Arthur's influence on my life and how it had all changed my perception of myself. Lucia listened in silence, and her gaze became softer as I spoke. When I finished, there were tears in her eyes. Claudia, you are an incredible woman. And if that's what makes you happy, then I support you. But remember. Realize that living authentically also means accepting the consequences of your choices. These words resonated deeply within me. The decision before me was not just about choosing a path, but about embracing who I really was. Whatever happened, I wanted to live authentically, without fear of judgment from others. With that in mind, I stood up and looked directly into Lucia's eyes. I'm ready to live my truth, even if it means making difficult choices. In the days that followed, I looked for the young man and shared my decision with him. I explained that my life could no longer be a fantasy. I needed more than fleeting adventures. He listened to me carefully, but was not surprised. I understand. And if you need space to discover yourself, I'll be here. Those words touched me deeply. The young man was not just an escape, but a door to a new Claudia. One who was willing to take risks and be truly free. And so, as I looked out the window on a sunny day, I realized that life was a beautiful mystery to be lived. Arthur's stories would always be with me, but now I knew I could write my own narrative, one that was rich in authenticity and courage. I was ready to face the future, not as a character, but as Claudia, the woman who finally chose to live her truth. And you, where are you watching this video from? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you like this heartwarming story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories.